Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin LaBeouf, the Joyce and Chauncey Buckeye Distinguished Professor in Marketing and Vice Dean of Faculty and Research here at WashU Olin Business School. Thank you for joining us. At WashU Olin, we're proud to bring you the Leadership Perspectives series, featuring insightful discussions with an impressive lineup of speakers from various perspectives. We're a community dedicated to pursuing new ideas and taking on challenges. We believe that events like this contribute meaningful insights and bring you to the gateway of ideas, innovation, and inspiration. Today's topic is a fascinating one. What does it mean to fail? In a world where many leaders see failure as an outcome to avoid at all costs, can it actually be the best outcome in a given situation? Can we fail intelligently and in a principled way? Our guest speaker, Cambry Nelson, has thought about this topic deeply and will discuss with Professor Kurt Dirks how her ideas about failure have informed her career path. This theme couldn't be more relevant to Olin's focus on values-based, data-driven leadership. After Cambry and Kurt's discussion, they'll answer a few of your questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions. In just a moment, you'll meet our guest speaker, but first, I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator, Kurt Dirks. Kurt is director of the Bauer Leadership Center. He's the Bank of America Professor of Leadership, and he serves as a senior advisor to the Chancellor for Leadership. He's best known for his research into the factors that affect trust within organizations and has published many award-winning articles on this topic. His research has also been covered by popular media, including Businessweek, Fortune, New York Times, and the Washington Post. Prior to his current roles, Kurt has served in a number of key leadership positions at the Olin Business School, including interim dean, and at the university, including acting provost and vice chancellor of international affairs. Kurt, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm sure our audience is eager to meet our guest and for our discussion to begin. So I'll now hand things over to you to introduce Cambry and to start our conversation. Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you, Robin, and hello to everyone this afternoon from Olin. We're really excited to have you with us today. And as Robin mentioned, we have a really fascinating topic, true grit, failing at things that matter. So very important, as Robin mentioned, and very exciting and a great title, True Grit, which, by the way, I like the John Wayne version better than the Jeff Bridges version of that movie. But today we'll do something a little bit different than that. So today I'm very excited to have with us Cambry Nelson. Cambry is currently at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she serves as the interim director of the Office of the President, Chief of Staff, Gender Equality Division. Cambry was also an MBA student here, so it was a really great pleasure that I got to have her in class, learn from her also in that class. And so she was a great leader here at Olin and has had a really successful career so far. Cambry, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and a little bit about what you've been up to. I think you were also at Accenture. So welcome, Cambry. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Professor Dirks. And it's really a pleasure to see you. I would say one of my best professors, certainly, but also to spend some time with the Olin community again as well. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I know these conversations always start with the question, tell me about yourself, but I always struggle with it. I'm typically a person who likes to talk about more so who I am more than what I do, especially when I'm not talking about or on behalf of my work, but me, myself. But I'm happy to talk a little bit about my journey thus far, career-wise. As you alluded to, I do work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm rounding out an interim director role as a chief of staff at the Office of the President of the Gender Equality Division. We'll get a little bit more into that later, I think. But, you know, prior to my work at the foundation, I served as an executive at Accenture. I focused really while I was there on sort of building our health and public sector's practice. And my consulting work really focused on a number of different areas of consulting, from sort of organizational strategy to change management, enterprise operational effectiveness, and a lot around process design of a lot of different clients, from high-tech clients, which is where I spent a lot of my work, to governments, managed care consortiums, and hospital systems. But I will say that, I think where my work and the proudest work I've ever done is actually as a community organizer and as a middle school and high school teacher. That got me my root very specifically into social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, where I think I became very close friends with failure. Maybe the very last thing I'll say is just a little bit about who I see myself to be. Um, I'm a parent, I'm a partner, I'm a writer, I really am a musical instrument tinkerer, and I'm really a community cultivator. I spend a lot of time, particularly with Black creatives in my area, in my neighborhoods in Seattle.
Well, great. Well, you bring a lot of different experiences and perspectives. This is going to be a great conversation. I don't ever remember you having too much failure in my experience, but I know that you're going to bring a lot, that you have a lot of experience in thinking about this issue. I know we'll do a couple questions here. I've got a question to get started in a moment. We can have a conversation about that. And then again, for the audience, we'll be taking questions later on. As Robin mentioned, make sure to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll pick those up along the way. But let me get started with a question on this. You and I had a great conversation a few days ago, just a little bit about your experience. And you have a quote, which I thought was a fascinating quote to really kick this off. The quote is, "I'm not afraid of failure. I'm afraid of succeeding at things that don't matter." Can you tell us a little bit about where that quote came from, and how has that shaped, your trajectory and your decisions in your life?
Yeah, thank you. I don't often have a lot of quotes that just stop me in my tracks. Uh, but this quote was shared with me maybe a few months ago, maybe 5 or 6 months ago, by Dr. Catherine Kiabatungi. She's the executive director of the African Population and sort of Health Research Center. I think this quote may be originally by William Carey, but when she said it, everyone in the room, you could just hear a pin drop. It's one of those sort of quotes that just reorient you entirely, and put things in perspective. It made me think about whether or not I felt like I was living a life of purpose, or what I would actually call worthwhile failure. And am I choosing to do things that matter, and try to succeed at those? And, Professor Dirks, I mean, the thing that lands with me a lot about this quote is really actually, very honestly, the anatomy. It sticks with me. I think it's guided a lot of the trajectory of my career, thinking about fear of failure and then thinking about choosing to sort of succeed at things that matter. Um, and it made me think a little bit about sort of my experience in sort of entrepreneurship previously, and how I learned a lot in those moments in my career around sort of intelligent failure. That's sort of a term from a Financial Times magazine or article a few months ago. Really, this idea around failing smart toward innovation. And then it was actually, moving from entrepreneurship into consulting, where I learned a lot about sort of how to think about consistent failure and systems of resiliency. Because when you're working with clients all the time, you are failing quite a bit, but the resiliency is where a problem that is just so stuck becomes dislodged and becomes something that is a solution that might stick to. It made me think a little bit, this quote really made me think about my current work, which is less about defining myself by how I fail and defining myself by how I want, what I want to try to succeed at the Gates Foundation. And I've had a few moments that have been more pivotal, really defining where this quote really came to life. And I'm happy to share a little bit about those, but wanna sort of pause and see if there's anything that sort of has resonated with you about the quote.
No, I think it's such an interesting quote in that it's this concept of things that matter, which, as you say, it really makes you think about what does that mean, and how we might think about our life differently. We often get caught in momentum from what we're doing, and I think being able to pause and think about that, I think, is a really great thing for all of us to do after the session today. So I love that. I love that also. Well, maybe we can have you share just a few of your experiences on, what have you learned about success factors, about things that matter, and maybe you can share a few experiences, and then I'll probably have some follow-up questions on there, and then we'll eventually get the audience involved on that.
That sounds great. And I think you alluded to just now a moment of pause. And I think that, um, for me, when this quote really came to life was actually a moment of pause that was teed up actually at my last career shift and change, the sort of bridge between consulting and what I do now. When I left the Olin world, my post Olin world, I moved into management consulting and I loved it. It's an accelerant. You learn a lot about different industries. You learn a lot about teamwork, about yourself, about humility, about really bridging that gap between strategy and implementation, which is just not flashy work. It's not flashy to really get into the depths of implementation. And it taught me a lot, of course, about failure as a route to innovation. And I'd work on these projects that involved sort of the riskiest new technology where we'd have to literally decide about the cost of success. I did feel like, and I want to kind of get into this moment where this quote was brought to life. I felt like consulting taught me a lot. And I did find sort of one challenge. And that challenge came to me around really the sort of the nature of consulting at that time. What's amazing is that, you get a chance to work with a lot of different clients, but it's also really indiscriminate. Whoever pays becomes your client. And one of the critiques I had heard, but not fully experienced, is that sometimes it can be a circular nature, right? Circular nature of an industry that sort of could perpetuate itself. Really, that sort of you work on sort of solving problems, but sometimes in the solving of problems, you actually create the next set. So, you could be working your way not out of a job, but really working your way into a job. And I had, heard of sort of these horror stories of friends who felt like they were doing and undoing some of their value-based work. I remember one particular friend in a different firm who sort of said, she's working on a project that was, working with lung cancer patients who were impacted by sort of the impacts of smoking. And then 3 months later, working with a nicotine company that was marketing to young people. And she just felt like she was constantly in this moment of doing and undoing. And I hadn't faced moments like that of my own. But I do maybe want to bring us to this moment, 2021. I think many of us can sort of picture that space and that time in the midst of the pandemic. For myself, I had some pretty significant health struggles within my family and job security. Employment-wise, very important to my stability, and I was at the cusp of a promotion that I've been working for 4 years. And it was actually at that moment that my boss kind of came to me and sort of said, "We've got this new project. Do you want to do it? Can you take it?" And I just found that at that moment in time, and I don't think the details matter. It was a client, it was a moment where I felt like I would have to be putting my principles in the balance. And I felt like saying no would mean that I would have failed at my job. Saying yes would have felt like I had failed at something differently, at myself. And ultimately, I had a very tough decision to make. And I decided I didn't want to have to choose between two failures. I actually wanted to choose think more fully about what it was worth succeeding in. This ultimately led to me leaving my job. It also led me toward, I had a really great mentor actually at Washington University when I was an undergrad, Dean McLeod, who gave me some advice. He said, never be careful not to push away without being pulled toward something new. And I felt very pulled toward this new work. And that's what landed me at the Gates Foundation. And I'll tell a little bit about, that's a little bit for me about failure, but I want to talk a little bit about how I think about success now. And I want to maybe share a little bit about my time at the Gates Foundation, or what I work on at the Gates Foundation, in a moment that happened just a year later, or just a handful of months later, that really sets up how I think about success. You might be familiar with the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation is a foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our co-chairs, Bill Gates, Melinda French Gates. And they started this organization because they had this value, this idea that where you're born should not determine whether or not you live, whether or not you have access to a healthy, productive life, or a life full of opportunities. And so they've dedicated the resources, right, to a number of different issue areas that focus on that. And that's a lot of issue areas. It's polio, it's malaria, it's financial inclusion programs, it's agricultural development, water, sanitation and hygiene, education, you name it. And as those program areas have sort of come up, or those issue areas have been funded, they've seen something pretty interesting, that there's sort of a number of populations, but one salient population that seems to be consistently experiencing disproportionately compounding barriers, right? And those have been women and girls. And so that gave rise actually to this division, this new division a couple years ago, 3 years ago, that I've had a chance to work with, that really focuses on this exact piece. We've got a number of teams in our division that look at sort of investing, philanthropy, and grant making, that looks to everything from health, maternal, newborn, and child health. So trying to curb maternal mortality, as well as infant mortality, to then developing and designing R&D around women's health products, to thinking about access to income and access to market and female labor force participation. So a focus is on that, to digital connectivity, closing the digital divide, to even thinking about the roles of mass media and entertainment and influencing norms, and then thinking about data and policy. So it's a wide range of teams that I focus on and I work on. And I like to bring this to life by thinking about sort of imagining, and this is sort of a very, very real example for our work, imagining a young woman in Nigeria who just received, maybe an iPhone and is hoping to make a little bit of money by being an Uber driver. She has a phone, but the questions that we sort of think about within our team is sort of things like, does she have access to internet on the phone? If she has access to internet, is the Uber app in her language? If the Uber app is in her language, does she have the time to use it, or does she have access to a car? If the answers of that are all yes, then does she have access to a bank account to store her money? It's sort of this really complicated lens through which we think about and take a systems approach really to a population question and challenge. So this was my dream job, and I started it, right after I left Accenture, and it was no more than 3 months into my new job where I received a call, and it was a call from my family. My family had faced this very significant tragedy, and it left my partner and I, and it was a split moment, at sort of the base of a choice as to whether or not to welcome 2 kids into our life, 2 children into our life, essentially to become parents overnight. And I think a lot of our work and our jobs, everyone's job is very, very, very demanding. But this choice in a lot of ways meant for me, it was having our 2.5-year-old and our 3-month-old Joanne, our family at the time. It really meant thinking about how I might need to redefine my life around what I consider to be success. And professionally, that meant that, the time navigating a transition like this meant tamping down sort of the energy I'd put toward my ambitions. At the time, logistically, different constraints were sort of emerging. But it also meant in many ways that while I might have to rethink about how far I want to go in this particular line in my career, it meant that my work actually gained a whole different layer of meaning. I stopped thinking a little bit about where to go in my career and how far to go in the organization, and started thinking about how far I'd go to actually realize the purpose of the work that I was working on, which was so fitting. Like, to know that, the one of the kids in our family would maybe be able to inherit a more equitable world, and that her brother would equally be, able to exist and fight for the world that he and his sister would live in. And so I guess I just want to talk about that a little bit, just simply to say that redefining success is such a critical part. It's not the only metric that I use for defining success, but it's something that really personalized, that success, that's something that matters. Success that the things that matter could look so big in the context of the world, or they could look so small, like in the context of your family. And so this quote's really shaped my career in a lot of ways. And that's a lot, Professor Dirks. So I'll pause there, but thanks for letting me talk about the quote and why it means something to me.
But I think it's a very enlightening example of the issue, and thinking about how times which force you, if I hear correctly, to think about really what matters. In the first case, it was a career opportunity. And in the second, it was a tragedy in the family that forced that. Do you think that, so people in the audience who are, maybe searching for that meaning or just have a hint that maybe I don't have it, do you have any thoughts or advice on how they might do this without having to go through a tragedy, like you did on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really good question. I think there's a lot that I sort of have been learning. I think you mentioned just a little bit earlier, success factors, sort of success factors that sort of point you in the direction around sort of um, how to bring this work or how to bring this book to life in your own life. I think there's a couple of them that I've been thinking about. The first has been, really sort of thinking about closing the gap between the culture gap around failure. So the gap between sort of a belief that failure matters and then our behavior reflecting that. I think there's a little bit of a gap. I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Um, then I think maybe the second one just that comes to mind, and I'll talk about it, is sort of um, asking the right questions at the right time with the right people, to identify the things that matter. And maybe the last one that I'm thinking about, um, success factor that you mentioned, I think is actually around thinking about collective success. So maybe I'll just start with the failure gap, the
Yeah,
culture
that'd be
gap,
very good. Yes.
failure that I'm thinking about. I've been given a lot of thought to this, and I've had amazing colleagues who've really pointed this out to me, which is that, if I were to go into a boardroom and I asked how many people believe that failure is essential to good business result, I think not most would raise their hand. And this is really important. But if I were to ask if they'd be willing to fail themselves, I do believe we'd have a lot fewer. And I'm curious, and I've been really curious about why that is. And I think, it's important. It's amazing that there's sort of, and really significant that there's these cultural strides that, I think they're contributed to a lot of things, right? But it's amazing that there's this cultural stride that we do believe that failure is important. However, while we don't necessarily have a problem with believing that failure matters, I do still think we might have a challenge with acting as if failure matters. And I think that sort of this culture change, if you will, is a little bit dependent upon sort of a personal relationship with failure, and organizational sort of disincentives and responses to failure. Personally, I've heard a lot of peers say, and myself included, right, that we link failure so quickly to our own worth and our identity. Instead of saying something like, I failed at something, I might say, I am a failure. Why? Why? I actually remember this being driven home as my first day as a middle school teacher. I think for those in the audience, if you've ever parented, taught, or actually been a middle schooler, which many of us have, I hope all of us have been a middle schooler, but then you're well versed with failure. But it's actually my first day as teaching when I came home and I got 30 phone calls 30 phone calls. I mean, my phone was ringing off the hook, and it was from families, it was from parents, it was from students. This was before computers were used primarily in the classroom. Um, I had learned that I had assigned the wrong assignment. Now, for those of you who are business school students, imagine if your marketing professor assigned a finance assignment, and then sort of said, for your first assignment, you'd be disoriented, you might be confused, you might be panicked, upset, mad. These 11-year-olds were all of those things and more, and their families were pretty frustrated. And I got to work the next day, and I have to tell you, I felt like a failure. I felt pretty ashamed. I felt very embarrassed, and I had this mentor, a colleague of mine, who I really am grateful for her, Christina. And she said, you didn't fail 30 times. You failed once, but it was echoed to you by 30 people. Keep in mind you did one thing wrong. Now, that was very important to me. It's changed the way that I think about the culture of my own failure. Did something wrong, I'm not wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that we get to absolve ourselves from failure. I mean, I couldn't imagine sort of like SpaceX saying, oh, I did one thing wrong when there's 100 people on board. What you do wrong matters, right? But keeping failure in perspective, not letting it become you, but right-sizing you, failing intelligently, these things that keep you from being reckless, but really in a courageous learning mode, I think matter a lot. They keep you wise and judicious, and I think humble and planful and really resilient. And I think that there's this bit, maybe the last point on this sort of piece that I think is very important is that organizations incentivize failure differently. We get to that space and place because it feels imperative. The fear of failure is so strong, active failure, acting as failure, that it dilutes us, or it voids, it sort of prevents us from risking trying the things that are worth being successful at. Then there's a lot of impact that's being left on the table. And I really want to sort of, think about how we reorient our cultures, our organizational cultures, to choose to focus on what matters, and then to create not just the safety but the security, cultures of security, to encourage individuals to be bold enough to try.
I think that's a very good. Yeah, I bet a lot of our audience is really interested in thinking about how might I create a culture that doesn't punish failure, that's secure. And I think you had an interesting example from our conversation. I remember about the type of questions and how you think about things at the Gates Foundation that really changed the frame of how to think about this. Could you share a little bit about that? And that may help some of the people in the audience think about this issue.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think that idea of asking the right questions with the right people at the right time helps to do that. And I think there's a number of questions that I've been, I think, gifted over the course of my career. I think, and I'll get to the Gates Foundation very shortly, but I think that I don't want to lose. I used to be in human-centered design thinking, social impact design firm is what I worked with and co-founded and cut my teeth on social entrepreneurship with. And how might we is a question that we would ask a lot. It's a question that really helps to think about focusing on the things that are more likely to succeed. And I like it, but how you fill in the rest of that question actually, I think, really matters. An example that it was gifted to me when I was early on thinking about doing human-centered design was a hospital in Italy that would ask the question, how might we make the ER more efficient? And then, it's a great question, but the wrong people were in the room. They asked that question with a lot of hospital staff in the room, which makes sense. Of course, it's a hospital staff are thinking about it. And then one person said, you know what? Who might be someone else that would know a little bit about efficiency and the analogy of a hospital? And they found a NASCAR pit crew knew a little bit about that idea of making something more efficient or effective. That's what NASCAR pit crews do. The car comes in, they have to figure out how to triage, quickly diagnose what's wrong, get it to the right space, and get it on its way. So asking the right question with the right people in the room matters. I remember another example to think about TSA thinking a lot about security lines, asking the question out, sort of saying, how do you make a security line shorter? Well, there's a different question you can ask, which is not how do you make it shorter. I mean, there's a lot of expenses, capital expense. There's a lot of expenses to making it shorter, right? You might have to change plane schedules. You might need to get more people, more lines. There's a ton of expenses. But what if instead Disney were in that room? Disney knows how to not necessarily make a line shorter, but how to make it feel shorter. People wait in lines all day in Disney World, right? So asking the right question. In consulting, I found that the right questions to ask around sort of that lead to very more specific success is why. Constantly thinking about with a client sort of how to cut through noise to actually get at the heart of the question to add value. And the question I found that really matters is why? Why are we doing it? Helps to become clear about purpose, ensuring that sort of you're focused on value at every moment of the time. But in my current work, I've actually found a question that is the most inspiring to me. It's not how might we, it's not why. It's actually, interesting enough, it's what if. It's what if we did. At the foundation, my experience has been that we're really gifted and really, really lucky to have the resources we do. And our teams, with that in mind, get a chance to imagine. We get a chance to think about some of the biggest challenges that exist on the planet. And the posture we take is not is one of what if we, is not a posture of assuming that we will succeed, at least in our lifetime. It's thinking about these big questions and saying, if we failed 99% of the time, what would happen? What if we did not on the 1% or the 10th time? It's been really liberating to think about what happens when a team is able to reorient their thinking to what if, and as the center of the work.
That I think is a really powerful question, and it really makes me think about also just how that question does a couple things. One, it helps you think bigger at the organization, and then I think as you describe it, also starts to presumably create a culture around, okay, we're going to go big, but we recognize that we may not always succeed. And I think we can all learn a lot from that. What if we could do X for our students here at WashU? I think that type of question will really help us think about things in a different way. So I really love that, and something we can learn from. We're going to go to the audience in just a minute here. But one more thing, let me make sure we get, so audience, again, make sure you put questions in. I'll start looking at those as Camber's talking here, but collective success, I know, is another topic that you were going to share a few insights about on the theme of success. Can you share a few insights on that? And then we're going to go to the audience after that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that you did bring this up. I when I'm thinking about sort of success factors in the world of sort of thinking about failure, and I'm thinking about culture, and then I'm thinking about questions. The other thing I think that has been a really important learning for me that I'm still learning is about sort of collective success as a way that we succeed at things that matter, even identify the things that matter. And I maybe want to think a little bit about this in the nonprofit world. And there's different ways to talk about this in for-profit worlds too. If it's value proposition is maybe the language that's used, but in the nonprofit world, we talk a lot about this idea of theory of change and theory of action. Theory of change is what your theory is about how the world works. You sort of put out that boldly. So how do I think change works when it comes to climate adaptation? How do I think change works when it comes to successful education that leads to economic mobility? I have a theory of change, but your theory of action is what you believe you can do in it. It's your comparative advantage, your value proposition. It's narrow. So when I say that at the foundation, we might ask big questions like, what if you could really use geo-targeting for a mosquito to understand which millimeter, length mosquitoes carry malaria and which don't? We ask the question, well, that's great, but what is our specific role in being able to do that work? And what's our specific role in making a dent when it comes to malaria, deaths related to malaria? We ask this question when it comes to maternal mortality. We have a theory of change around how maternal mortality can be lowered. But what's our specific role as a foundation in doing that is something we think a little bit about. And what surprised me about really having a very clear sense of your theory of action is that when you narrow in on what you can do, there's a really different acknowledgement about what we need other people to do, what everyone else can do as well. And that it has to be collective. I think the work that I referenced in sort of around the digital divide, I think is an example of this, where within our work on a digital divide, we actually need mobile network operators to determine where sort of towers are placed to have wider coverage. We need the internet to be in more languages so content is more related. We need public and private and academia, public and private partnerships in academia to really be able to achieve a different degree of research and understanding of actually what the problem is, right? Where the opportunities are. We need governments to support volume guarantees when it comes to procurement and manufacturing. It's a sort of idea of sort of collective success that means that our businesses work differently, CSR works differently, our philanthropies fund differently, our governments act differently. And I think that there's, and sort of what makes me, I guess, really invigorated by this idyllic collective success is that it's something that I feel like is a must, feel an imperative around it, frankly. I think a little bit about, a book, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and she gives this image of sort of our world as sort of this old house. which I think is really compelling. She talks about the creaky floors, the shaky foundations, and this idea of sort of saying when you're in a house, you really have this sort of consistent attention and repair that needs to happen in it. And she sort of says, you know, even if you didn't build this house with a shaky foundation, if you've inherited it as your current occupant, you're responsible for further decline, but you're also responsible for future repair so that it remains standing for sort of generations to come. And I like that a lot because it does really, to me, think about that success at things that matter doesn't necessarily look like, doesn't necessarily look like, fixing the window trapping, but it looks like really repairing pipes that might break and might burst. And you've got to have the right people with the right expertise, asking the right questions with the right orientation toward failure that are working collectively to really be able to ensure that the infrastructure is meant to last and exist to hold for generations to come. And so those are some of the things that really come to mind to me, Professor Dirks.